Professor Tyler Anbinder teaches history at George Washington University, and he has a new book released last year called Plentiful Country: The Great Potato Famine and the Making of Irish New York. And I'm delighted to have him here and discuss the book. Tyler, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yes, and it's an honor on my end. I'd like to start by mentioning that you were the primary, I suppose, historical consultant to the film director Martin Scorsese and his 2002 film Gangs of New York, which I enjoyed quite a bit. So, how did the connection happen?
Well, I should point out for the historical accuracy that I was one of the advisors,
Oh, okay.
probably not the primary one. He had another person, Lucy Sant, who was there in Rome on the set, but I probably did the main job of historically vetting the script before they started shooting.
Okay.
And in terms of your question was, how did I get involved?
Yes.
Well, so I was working on my book about 5 points. At the same time, they were doing the pre-production work for Gangs of New York. And I was spending a lot of time at the New York Municipal Archives, and his researchers were spending a lot of time at the New York Municipal Archives. And so they heard that I was there and what I was working on. I heard that they were there and what they were working on. And then they reached out to me and asked me if we could collaborate in terms of uh, me looking at the screenplay, and specifically, they wanted me to point out any and all historical inaccuracies. And so that's what I did over several drafts of screenplay. And then, and then I don't know how much detail you want, but so then they asked me to come to New York. I'm here in Arlington, Virginia right now, and that's where I was living at the time. And they asked me to come to New York and meet with Scorsese and go over the screenplay with him and point out the inaccuracies to him. And so we did that, and I went to New York, and first they had me meet with the first assistant director, which to me sounded like a very minor role, but it turns out that's the right-hand man of the director. And so I met with him and I went through page by page on the screenplay and pointed out all the historical inaccuracies. And then they asked me to meet with Scorsese, and they took me into this other room, and Scorsese sitting there at this little table with me, and then behind him, along the wall, are like 10 of his minions sitting there, all taking notes also. And so then the first assistant director said, "All right, Tyler, please now do exactly what you just did with me, with Marty." And I had done that. It took me about an hour to do that with the first assistant director. And I started doing the same thing with Scorsese, except with Scorsese, everything I would point out, he would then have an answer. So I would say, okay, so on this page right here, you have this happening in this year, but really that didn't happen until 20 years later. And he'd say, yes, I know that, but part of the job of the director is to bring big themes to the viewer, and sometimes the themes, to fit them in a movie and have the movie make sense in terms of a narrative, you have to take things that happen at different times and put them together so that the people in the play aren't aging by decades at a time while the events take place. And I said, oh, okay, that makes sense. And I went to the next page and I said, all right, on this page, here's a problem, and this isn't right. And he says, oh, I know that's not right, but that scene appeared to me in a dream, and dreams are really important to me. And I really, when I have vivid dreams during the writing process, I believe that's like a message from my inner mind that something has to be included in the movie. And so that's why that scene is in the movie. I said, okay, that makes sense. Turn the page. All right, on this page, this isn't right. That didn't happen like that at all. He says, yes, I know that, but that scene is like that because that scene is an homage to a scene in the 1926 film Battleship Potemkin. And I take my role in the kind of pantheon of directors very seriously, and I like to pay my respects in each of my films to my predecessors and the directors who helped make cinema what it is. Can't argue with that. Turn the page. I said, this scene, you have these people coming off the boat. I don't know if you remember this scene. There's a scene where immigrants come off the boat. They immediately are made into US citizens. Then they go to a table right next door and they immediately sign up for the Union Army. And the camera is kind of panning. They get off the boat, they become citizens, they sign up for the army, they're put into uniforms, they get back on a different ship to take them to the front lines, and then the camera goes around 360 degrees and it ends up back where it started. But instead of the immigrants getting off the boat, there's now a different boat with coffins being taken off the boat of soldiers killed in the Civil War. So I said, oh my gosh, everything is wrong there. I said, you couldn't become a citizen right when you get off the boat. You could sign up for the army right when you got off the boat. And that did then make you a citizen sooner, but that made you a citizen after 2 years, not right away. And your scene implies that they're compelled to be soldiers in order to get citizenship. But the truth is, you could get citizenship without being a soldier. In fact, the only people who couldn't be compelled to be soldiers were immigrants. And he says, yes, I know all those things, but the point of that scene is the 360-degree pan. So you have to keep in mind, this is, when we're talking here, this was 2000. Might have even been 1999. And he said, they've just come up with this new technology, computer graphics. So what I'm doing there, this is all a green screen, but I'm panning around there. And in the end, it looks like I've gone 360 degrees and there's a different ship there than was there at the beginning. He said, but it's not, it's all computer graphics. I'm the first one who's going to be using this outside of like a Star Wars movie, and every director's jaw will be on the floor when they see what I did. And I had to come up with some reason to do all that panning. And so that's why I put all those things together, even though I know they didn't really all happen at the same time. So it goes on like that. And we do that for 3 hours. And finally, towards the end, there's one scene where he has a different reaction. It's one scene where I say, all right, there's a scene where the Leonardo DiCaprio character is dragging everybody he can find to vote for the Irish candidate for sheriff instead of the Daniel Day-Lewis nativist candidate for sheriff. And he's dragging all these people in, and the scene shows people going into a booth to vote with curtains, and the curtains are parted so you can see the person voting, and there's a piece of paper with names on it and little boxes, and the voter takes a pencil and ticks off the name of the candidate for sheriff that way, and that's how they vote. And I said, that's not how people voted back then. There was no booth, there were no curtains. You took your ballot, a pre-printed ballot with your candidates, and you put it into a glass bowl. And that was how people voted. And he said, oh, we can change that. And he turns around to his minions behind me and says, fix that scene. So I'm like, aha. And that's the only thing in the 3 hours. Every other thing he said, yes, I know that's wrong, but he had a reason, which is fine. It's his movie. It doesn't have to be historically accurate. You know, the way he put it to me at another visit was, he said, people should no more think that people should not learn their history from movies any more than they should learn history from an opera. He said, nobody expects an opera to be historically accurate. Nobody should expect film to be totally historically accurate. But the denouement of the story is 2 years later, the film comes out. I go to the movie. I'm looking forward to that scene in the voting booth to see my one contribution to the film. And it gets to the scene, and the line of people comes to vote. There's a table with that they're going past. I'm thinking, oh, that's the table with the glass bowls. But no, the camera pans, and it goes to a booth with curtains, and a person ticks off the thing. So I think he learned a lot from me, but he didn't change the film at all because of me. At least not in ways I could see.
Certainly. I see. So, what are your thoughts on the film's depictions of Irish Americans?
Well, so what I think is and this is why I tell people that, you know, the story I just told you doesn't really matter that much, because, right, individual historical events are not portrayed accurately in the film. But the overall theme of the film, that the Irish were discriminated against, were, you could almost say, persecuted, were hated, were reviled, had every possible roadblock thrown in their way to success, and literally had to fight for their rights. That theme is completely accurate. And so the theme of the movie, I think, and the themes that the movie conveys are completely accurate and important. And the what you learn is the screenwriters, because then I talked to some of the screenwriters as they were working. The screenwriters care zero about historical accuracy. What they're completely focused on is the relationships between the characters and making those relationships work on an emotional level. Like they're really obsessed with the emotional impact of scenes. Like, when Daniel Day-Lewis and Cameron, or when Leonardo DiCaprio and Cameron Diaz like kissed for the first time. Like to them, the whole movie to that point has been building up so that when they kiss, the emotion of that like overwhelms you in the audience and you cry or you whatever. And that when Daniel Day-Lewis takes out his big knife and is stabbing people in a riot, that you feel the revulsion or the thrill, depending on how you look at it, that the people in the riot would have felt. That is totally what they're focused on. And so everything else, the things that you and I would look at as terms of historical accuracy, those to them are just props to be manipulated however they want to get the emotional impact they desire. So it's interesting. What I learned from Scorsese was he had been working on this film for almost a quarter century. He had this idea. He had written a treatment. He had commissioned a screenplay, and then just for literally 20 years, he kept trying to sell it to studios, and they said, no, nobody's going to like this. There's no female lead. It's all violence. Nobody really cares about this. And so he had been working with various people over a quarter of a century to get the film made, and he kept making compromises to get studios interested. And so one of the things, he told me about the original. The original was very historical. It had Boss Tweed had a big role. There was Fernando Wood, who's not in the movie at all, who has a big role. It was very much following the historical events. And the studios kept saying to him, nobody cares about Fernando Wood, mayor of New York from 1861 to 1863. People don't care about him. They want the love story. They want the violence. And so he took the history out and put in a little bit of romance and a lot of violence.
I see. So, what do you believe is the least known fact about early Irish immigrant and settlement to America?
Well, I'm going to interpret early to mean like the period we're talking about with the Gangs of New York films, so mid 19th century
Right.
America. I think the least known fact about them is how much success the famine Irish, and by famine Irish, I mean the Irish who came during the Great Potato Famine in the 1840s and 1850s, this nearly decade-long disaster, a catastrophe in Ireland where 1 out of every 8 people in Ireland died, and millions more were made, terribly sick, or walking skeletons. And so you have refugees, more than 1 million refugees from that famine come to America, and most of them land in New York. And I think what's little known, historians have always focused on how difficult their lives were, how they came they came famished, sick, poor compared to other, they were the poorest immigrants ever to arrive in America. They're discriminated against. And yet what we don't know is that actually the famine Irish did fairly well in America. They had a lot of upward mobility. And historians have always assumed that they didn't, that because of all these obstacles, that they were trapped in poverty. And what I show in my book that you mentioned at the beginning, Plentiful Country, by tracing thousands of these immigrants to see what happens to them over their lives, is that they actually had a lot of upward mobility, that the economic opportunities in the United States were so great that even Irish immigrants whose religion is reviled, who because of their kind of ethnic background are looked at as inferior. It's thought that they just can't succeed because they are just inherently lazy and stupid. And with all those things working against them, they actually do pretty well. And by the end of their lives, the people who came during the famine as adults, if you look at the men, about 40% of them end up in white collar jobs by the end of their lives, mostly as business owners, running saloons, running groceries, things like that. And that's the thing that we tend not to know about the famine Irish, that they succeed and they succeed pretty quickly, um, despite all those obstacles.
That's wonderful. So, what caused the Irish famine?
Well, so there's two basic answers to that. There's the what caused the potato crop to fail is part one, and then part two is what caused people to starve. So on the one hand, the first part of it is so Ireland has about 8 million people before the famine strikes in the mid 1840s. And probably two-thirds of those people are living in poverty. And poverty for Ireland is really poverty. We're talking about, probably a couple of months of the year they don't have enough food. They're going to 2 meals a day instead of three, and maybe by August, 1 meal a day. And for probably half the population of Ireland, the only thing they have to eat is potatoes. And I don't mean that they eat potatoes with every meal. Potatoes is the entire meal. Potatoes for breakfast, potatoes for lunch, potatoes for dinner. And that's because Ireland became, for its size, overpopulated. So you think 8 million people in Ireland in 1845. That's twice as many people as live there today. And so the Irish countryside didn't really have enough acreage to feed all its inhabitants. And so what people ended up doing, at first you would grow some potatoes and some oats and some vegetables, some wheat maybe, but you learn that you can feed more people for more days with the potatoes than you can with those other things. So you slowly and surely start growing less of those other things and more potatoes until by the 1830s, half the population of Ireland is growing only potatoes because that fills them up and keeps them fed. And potatoes are kind of miraculously nutritious. They have virtually everything you need. They don't have protein, but besides that, they have virtually everything you need. And so people survive on just potatoes. You might get meat. Half the population of Ireland is maybe eating meat 2 times a year, Christmas and Easter. And other than that, just potatoes. And so if you're in that situation and then this mysterious blight comes, which came from the Americas, because the seed potatoes, so these little tiny potatoes that you put in the ground and that turn into big potato plants, those come from the Americas. And there was a fungus-like infestation in these little seed potatoes that came from America that probably, and the fungus-like thing comes from either Mexico or South America, in the guano, the bird droppings that American farmers use to fertilize their crops. And American farmers are growing the seed potatoes that then get shipped to Europe and put in the ground in Ireland. And so the fungus, and in the Americas, this infestation didn't really amount to much because we have hot, dry summers and the fungus can't grow. But in Ireland, where you have very cool, damp, wet summers, the fungus-like thing flourishes. And as a result, you end up with this infestation. And the first year, maybe half the crop is destroyed and people manage to get by one way or another. But the second year, in 1846, 90% of the potato crop is destroyed because people have no comprehension. They don't have the means to discovering what the source of the problem is. So imagine if you're eating potatoes for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and then the entire crop is destroyed, you're going to have starvation. And yet, what we know is that there didn't need to be 1 million people dying because the English, right? So Ireland at this point is a colony of Great Britain, the English had the means to feed people and prevent starvation. And we know this because after a year of massive starvation, where the English government, and we know this from looking at their internal records, the English government was like, oh, those Irish, they're lazy. It's their own fault. And then the English government said, again, in these internal records, well, so if 1 million Irish die, that's okay. There are too many people there anyway. It's God's will. But by 1847, the international public reaction against the English indifference to the Irish starvation was so great that the Irish government said, okay, we have to do something. And they opened soup kitchens all over Ireland, and the starvation stopped. So we know that even though the blight probably couldn't have been prevented, that the starvation could have been prevented had the English reacted differently. And then to make matters worse, after a year of the soup kitchens, the English said, we can't afford this anymore, so we're going to stop them, and the starvation starts again. So it's very clear that even though the blight was unpreventable, the starvation certainly was.
I see. It reminds me a lot of the that document, The Modest Proposal by Jonathan Swift. He was addressing the same issue. Like I think Ireland
Mhm.
was going through a starvation crisis at that time, and he was highlighting it, albeit, in a very comic satirical manner,
Sure. Right, from an earlier era.
certainly. So, why did America become a destination for the famine Irish rather than, say, continental Europe?
America becomes the destination because, first of all, the United States by that point already has this reputation as a land of opportunity and upward mobility that's unrivaled in the rest of the world. So one reason the Irish want to go to America is because they feel like um, they can do better economically in the United States than they can in any other place. Second, it's known as a land of freedom in the sense that there's religious liberty. It might not be that Catholics were beloved, but they were not put under any legal restrictions the way the Irish were in Ireland. Um, and there's the democracy part of it too. The United States is a democracy. The Irish yearned to be independent of Great Britain. And so the idea of going to some other part of Europe and living under another monarch did not appeal to them. But going to America where you could vote, right? So and voting was a huge thing to the Irish. It meant you were the equal of every other citizen. And so all those three things, the opportunity, the religious freedom, and the chance to be in a fully participating citizen in a democracy were all very important to them.
So, to what extent did the migrants keep their faith and, I'm guessing, Catholicism when in America?
So that's a hard thing for historians to judge. And I spent a lot of time grappling with that question over years as I worked on Plentiful Country. The answer is first of all, it's hard to know for sure. But second of all, what appears to be the case is, and when you look at the records that do exist, I mean, clearly the majority of Irish immigrants in America stick to their Catholicism. Now, we know on the one hand that, and this is kind of a continuation of what's happening in Ireland to some extent, the Irish are not huge churchgoers in New York. We know that because the number of churches can't in New York, Catholic churches can't nearly hold all the Catholic immigrants who have arrived during the potato famine. So, and you don't see stories in the newspapers of the Catholic churches that do exist in New York, bursting at the seams with parishioners at Sunday Mass. So the majority of the Irish immigrants are still Catholics, but they're not going to church all the time. And so, it would take another historian more versed in the history of Irish Catholicism to kind of tell you what that means. But there's also a kind of tension between the desire to maintain one's Catholicism and the desire to be accepted in the United States, which is not a very accepting place for Catholics. And so you see that, for instance, in the question of where the immigrants are going to send their kids to school. So the Catholic leaders of New York say, oh, this is great. We have tens of thousands of new Catholic children in New York. Their parents will send them to our Catholic schools. They'll pay that tuition, and that will support these schools. But that doesn't happen. The Irish overwhelmingly send their kids to the public schools. Even though they're priests, we know this from reading the Catholic newspapers of the period, the Catholic Church keeps saying, send your kids to the Catholic schools. We need to keep them good Catholics. We need the tuition income. But the New York Irish aren't doing that. They're overwhelmingly sending their kids to the free public schools. So it's hard to know whether that's because it's free and they can't afford it, or it's because the famine immigrants value the assimilation that will take place in the public schools, mixing with non-Catholics. Or it could be that this is kind of a way to kind of get out from under the sway of priests who you might think are too overbearing in kind of telling you how to live your lives. So it's hard to know, to what extent those three things are at play and in what proportion. And it's almost never mentioned in the Irish press in New York or the press in New York at all. Every once in a while, the leading newspaper in New York, the leading Irish newspaper was called the Irish American, and it was explicitly non-religious. So it didn't ever take a stand, in favor of Catholics, in favor of Protestants. In fact, it preached. It was kind of very forthrightly non-religious. It said, to be successful in America, you cannot be beholden to priests and so it encouraged people to not listen to their Catholic leaders and to send their kids to public schools. And so in that way, it ran afoul of the Catholic leadership, which then started its own newspaper to try to counterbalance that. But the Catholic newspapers never really did as well as the Irish American. So all those things give you, imply what was going on and the proportion of people who felt one way or another, but it's very hard to get it in people's minds. What you do see is when people, at the end of their lives, people tend to, however, choose to have Catholic burials, to get buried at Calvary Cemetery in Queens rather than Greenwood or one of the other non-denominational cemeteries. And so there is evidence that, at the end of their lives, people are still devoted to their Catholicism, but maybe not so much when it comes to educating their children or going to mass every week.
I see. So was I guess, the nativist sentiments represented by Daniel Day-Lewis in the Gangs of New York movie, did they pre-exist the arrival of the Irish, or did they spring up in reaction to the Irish arrival?
So the answer is kind of both. Definitely pre-existed. So you have in New York, if we just want to take New York as the example, you have in the 1830s an anti-Catholic immigrant party, political party known as the Native American Democratic Association, big long name. And they actually run Samuel F.B. Morse, who becomes famous later for inventing the telegraph, as their candidate for mayor. But he only wins 2% of the vote. So clearly they're nativists, but there aren't so many, or if they are, they're not willing to make their nativism more important than their devotion to, say, the Democratic or the Whig parties. Then in the mid-1840s, nativist political groups become more popular. In part, this is because there are more Catholic immigrants coming to the United States. And so that group is called the American Republican Party, and they actually elect a couple of congressmen from Pennsylvania and from Massachusetts. Their mayoral candidate in New York is a guy named James Harper, who runs the publishing company that becomes Harper Brothers and eventually Harper Row and is now HarperCollins. And he wins the mayoralty of New York. So clearly showing that there's more nativist sentiment by the mid-1840s. Now, he wins in part because one of the two political parties, the Whigs, decides not to run a candidate. And tacitly endorse Harper. And so that's in part why he wins. And then when they run candidates in the next election, when the Whigs don't abandon the field, the nativists don't do very well. So there's nativism existing. But then the reason that nativist political parties, and in particular what becomes known as the Know Nothing Party, does so well in the mid 1850s is, as you said, because there are so many Catholic immigrants coming to the United States as a result of the famine in the 10 years between 1845, when Harper becomes mayor of New York, and 1854, when the Know Nothings burst on the scene and elect more than 100 congressmen, um, uh, 8 or 9 governors, thousands of local officials, and so forth. And so it's both. It exists before, but it becomes the most popular it ever becomes in all of American history because of the huge influx of the famine Irish in the 1840s and 50s.
Right. I remember doing a presentation in my university school class about the book, was it the terrible uh, memoirs of Maria Monk? Yeah, and
Sure.
awful recollections or something like that. Yeah, and
Awful
yes,
disclosures.
awful disclosures. Thank you very much. Yeah, it was this terribly anti-Catholic tract that was likely a hoax, no, obviously a hoax. Sorry, and
Yes.
it became it became such a popular work because of this, because of the nativist sentiments and the rise of the American Party. Yeah, so tell me more about how anti-Catholicism and nativism they intertwine.
Sure. So just for those of your listeners who maybe don't understand the distinction, anti-Catholicism clearly means, against Catholics, but nativism is a term generally used to mean being resenting or fearing immigrants in general, not specifically Catholic immigrants. And so like you said, there's a long history of anti-Catholicism in the United States that goes all the way back to, the colonial period, right? The only unifying holiday that was celebrated in all the 13 colonies was Pope Day, which was this English holiday which celebrated the defeat of the Catholic plot against the English monarchy, the attempt to burn Parliament in the late 1600s. And so what you have in all the 13 colonies on Pope Day was you would have little parades through your town parading papal effigies. And at the end of the parade, you would light the papal effigy on fire and burn the Pope. In those days, I don't know if your listeners these days, but ever played the game Hangman, where you have a word and you have to guess letters, and if you miss, you make the various parts of the body. They used to play Hangman back in the 1700s, but it was the Pope was the person you were hanging. So that's how much anti-Catholicism infused the American colonies and then the early United States. But in the colonies in the early United States, people loved having immigrants because you had a huge country and a very small population, and Americans were very self-conscious about this and were afraid that the British, who had a relatively small country and a large population, could send over their armies and invade and take back over the United States, as they tried to do in the War of 1812. And so Americans constantly wanted more immigrants because the more people you had, the more you could defend the country against invasion and the more prosperous the country could become. So you have this tension between we don't like Catholics, but we want immigrants. And that wasn't the problem for the first 150 years of the American colonies and then the United States, because the immigrants were overwhelmingly Protestants. But starting in the 1830s, you get more and more Catholics coming until by the time of once the famine starts in 1845, now the majority of immigrants are Catholic. And back in the 1830s, remember I mentioned Samuel F.B. Morse and his run for the mayoralty of New York, the reason he had become popular even before he's known as the inventor of the telegram is because he had written this tract in which he claimed that there was a conspiracy by the Pope to flood the United States with Catholic immigrants to make it majority Catholic, so one day the Pope could move the Vatican from Rome to the United States. And in particular, Morse said in his book, St. Louis was going to be the new Rome. And that would be where the Pope would establish, because the Mississippi River was the great river of America, just like the Tiber was the great river of Italy. And so he thought the Pope would come here. And so Morse in his tract says we've got to stop the immigrants because there are too many Catholics now. And so by the mid 1840s, and he wrote that in the early 1830s when there weren't very many Catholic immigrants. But now you're in the mid 1840s, and all of a sudden, Catholics are the majority of the immigrants, and people start saying, hey, maybe Morse was right. Maybe there is this plot. And that especially became credible after 1848, when there are all these attempted revolutions in Europe that are suppressed by the various monarchies of Europe, including in Italy. And so now it seems reasonable to think, the Pope sees the writing on the wall. The people came to, the mobs came to the gate, and they almost succeeded in toppling the Pope. The Pope's now stepped up his plan to move the papacy to America, and he's sending more and more of these Catholic immigrants. He got the Irish to come over. And so it's for the first time kind of in the late 1840s, early 1850s, with the potato famine, that Americans start linking immigration, which they'd always liked, with Catholics who they had always hated, and now start saying, oh, wait, maybe immigrants aren't such a good thing. But what's really interesting and important, I think, to note is that even the Know Nothings, the most successful anti-immigrant political party in all of American history, even they never called for stopping immigration to the United States, even of Catholics. They never said we should have no Catholic immigrants. What the Know Nothings want to do is they said, having the immigrants is good. We need their labor. We just shouldn't give them political rights. We should allow them to come here, but they should have to wait 21 years before they can vote instead of 5 years. So even back then, even with all their anti-Catholicism, they were willing to have Catholics in the United States. They just didn't want Catholics to be as powerful as the Protestants.
Yes, yeah, very interesting. So one of the most prominent feature of the anti-Irish sentiment that was growing in the United States at that time were the "No Irish Need Apply" signs placed outside businesses in the help wanted ads, so to speak. So tell me about the origins of these signs.
Sure. Well, here's where we have to do some myth busting. So there were never "No Irish Need Apply" signs in windows. The reason we can know that is, first, they're never mentioned in contemporary records. And that makes sense because if you put a sign, "No Irish Need Apply," in your window is going to be smashed by a rock pretty soon. What you do have, however, are "No Irish Need Apply" advertisements in newspapers. Those are real. And you could do that in part because mostly you would run those ads anonymously. You'd say, I want a servant, no Irish need apply, send applications to this. And sometimes it would be an address without your name, but sometimes it would just be a box, a PO box, or it would be with the newspaper. So you could run those ads and not let it be known who you were. And those are fairly common. They're not everywhere because most newspapers refuse to run them because they know, because their Irish customers say, we're going to boycott your paper if you run these ads. So most newspapers won't run them, but so many people try to put ads with that in them that sometimes they sneak through, and the editor that day is out sick, and there's a subordinate who doesn't know the rule and just prints the ad. So hundreds of these ads run. And so we know that those are a thing. What was your question about them, though?
The origins of them. Why do they exist?
Well, so they exist because, the number one thing that the Irish would get hired for would be as domestic servants. So people who would cook and clean for you in your home. And so whereas you might say, okay, that guy who's going to go dig a ditch for me, he can be Irish. That doesn't really affect me that much. But someone who's going to be living in your home, feeding your children, babysitting for them when you're out, you're going to be afraid that, that maid may kind of inculcate Catholic ideas into your kids' minds while you're out. And there was a big fear. And it wasn't completely ungrounded because popes and the bishop of and eventually archbishop and eventually cardinal of New York, John Hughes, would say openly all the time, my goal is to convert every American to Catholicism. So if you're a Protestant and you see Bishop Hughes says, my goal is to convert you to Catholicism, and you're going to be maybe afraid to let a Catholic maid into your house and be around your children. So that might be why you'd run an ad saying, I'm looking for a maid, no Irish need apply, because you don't want a Catholic potentially uh, having access to your children and so forth. So they're in newspaper ads, not in signs. So the signs become kind of a novelty item that are sold in Irish American gift shops, and and they're quoting something that used to appear in newspaper ads, but they were never actually signs that you would see in a window.
Okay. Right.
And I think in part the the origin of them is, what you do clearly have evidence of is signs in American windows later on saying, we won't serve blacks, we won't serve Latinos. Um, and the Irish, knowing that they had been um, discriminated against in earlier generations, want to show that they experience that same kind of discrimination. And so the sign develops as a novelty item, taking quotes from newspaper ads. And so then people start to think, oh, we had those signs too. But there's a reason you can see historical evidence of, no blacks, no Mexicans, but you don't see historical evidence of signs like those were actual signs in windows for the Irish. Newspaper ads, not signs.
I see. Okay. I stand corrected. Right. So, you mentioned early on about, yeah, Boss Tweed being one of the characters in the Gangs of New York movie. I believe he's played by
Mm-hmm.
Jim Broadbent.
That's right.
And he was involved in the organization known as Tammany Hall. So, what was that?
So Tammany Hall was the name used to describe the Democratic organization in New York City. Um, all the political parties in New York and other places too, but in New York would have their meetings in uh, these kind of public gathering places. So you would have New York was full of halls that you could rent out for. You could rent it out for a wedding. You could rent it out for a fraternal organization. You could have a musical production there and a theater production. And so New York was full of halls. The Democrats back in the 1810s um, started in New York, associating themselves with this this kind of Native American figure whose name they translated as Tammany. And so they started calling the place where the Democrats met in the 1830s as Tammany Hall. And it was just a building. But eventually, because the Democrats always met at Tammany Hall, the name Tammany Hall became synonymous with the Democratic organization in New York. So then, even when they eventually moved and built new buildings to house the Democratic organization, they called the new buildings Tammany Hall also. So the building is literally called that, and it's where the organization meets. And by organization, I mean the Democratic Party in those days was run by a council. And the members were elected from each ward in the city. It's where they did their fundraising. It's where they had their galas and so forth. And so Tammany Hall was merely the name of the organization. By the 1850s, certain people tend to exert inordinate power in the Democratic organization and become known as bosses of the party within the city. And the first one who really achieves that status is, as you mentioned, Boss Tweed. This is in the 1860s, really at the end of the Civil War and onward. So from the mid 1860s on, William Tweed is acknowledged to be the quote unquote boss of the New York City Democratic Party because he has so much control over the members of the council that run the party and who make the nominations. By the late 1860s, he's put in place a whole series of fundraising mechanisms by which he demands kickbacks from city contractors in order to get contracts with the city. And part of that money goes to Tweed and his henchmen, and the rest of the money goes into the coffers of the party. Some of that money is used then to run election campaigns, but some of it is used for these charitable programs that the party runs. So keep in mind, this is an era where there's no government welfare programs, there's no unemployment insurance, there's no Medicaid. And so if you are a Democrat and you are injured on the job, there's no workman's compensation in those days. So you're out of work and your family might go hungry. And so what Tweed had was a huge series of operatives in the city. So, the city was divided into 22 wards. The 22 wards were divided up into districts. The districts were divided up so that every block had a Democratic leader on it. And that leader was typically a saloon keeper. And so if the saloon keeper on your block heard that you were out of work, you had gotten injured on the job and you wouldn't be able to work for months, he'd make sure that some of that money that Tweed had collected through kickbacks to the government would get to you in the form of food for your family or coal on your doorstep if you were cold in the winter, or he'd help find you a job when you were able to work again. And in all those ways, you have a private welfare system that's run by Tammany Hall, the Democratic organization, that helps fill the gap before publicly funded welfare programs are started.
Yes. So you mentioned there's a scene in the Gangs of New York movie where there was an election for the sheriff, and the barber, played by Brendan Gleeson, was elected against the nativist candidate. Were
Right.
such campaigns of like mass voting blocks exist at that time?
Sure. Absolutely. You have some of these campaigns, the 1850s and 1860s is the highest political, voting turnout in all of American history. It was, the election of 1860, you have about 90% of the population turns out to vote, which is just, we don't get half that today, even in the most contested election. So, yeah, you have huge turnouts, and you do, starting in the late 1850s, early 1860s in New York, you do have these contests sometimes where the Irish are supporting one candidate, and typically the party, as in the movie, the main party is supporting a different candidate. And in fact, sheriff is one of the first campaigns. In the 1857 race for sheriff in New York is one of those campaigns where the Democrats nominate one guy for sheriff, and the Irish say, hey, wait a second. We're giving you all these votes. The reason the Democrats keep winning in New York is because of our votes, but you never nominate any Irish for any important offices. So in 1857, the Irish run their own candidate for sheriff, and he does win the race. Now, it's a little more complicated than that in real life. It wasn't just a question of Irish versus non-Irish. There were factions within the Democratic Party. One was kind of the Fernando Wood faction. The other was the faction that was becoming the Boss Tweed faction, but Tweed hadn't really become so powerful yet. And so there's factionalism that goes beyond Irish and non-Irish, but the movie kind of glosses over that because they have to keep things simple and understandable, which makes sense. And so, but yeah, there are races like that. And you have in the Irish American, the newspaper I mentioned before, you have editorials that say, hey, this isn't fair. We give you all our votes. You never nominate any Irish immigrants for office. This has to change. And if you don't do this, we're going to boycott you, or we're going to run our own candidates. And so the 1857 race for sheriff is one of the first instances of that.
So was politics one of the main means for the Irish Americans to get ahead, so to speak, to earn white collar jobs?
So I wouldn't say it's the main way. I think starting your own business is definitely the main way to get ahead. That and buying real estate. And so one of the things that's important to understand when I talked before about how the Irish got ahead and how so many of them were able to get white collar jobs was one of the ways you do that is by saving up your money working in a menial job in New York and then leaving New York and going someplace else where you can afford a house. So it was very common. It was quite common to see an Irish immigrant come to New York, work 5 years, 10 years as a day laborer, doing something very menial, take their savings, and they might save $400, $500, which would be the equivalent of maybe $15,000 today. And in New York, that might be a down payment, 10% of the price of a small house. But you go across the river to New Jersey and go 5 miles west of the Hudson River, and you could buy a whole house for that $500 and have some money left over. So what a lot of the immigrants do is they move in that way. But getting back to your question, in terms of the how you get ahead, so politics often was a helper. So, for instance, if you wanted to be a saloon keeper, and as I mentioned, opening your own business was one of the keys to getting ahead, and more famine Irish immigrants opened saloons than any other kind of business. And if you opened a saloon, you pretty much had to have a connection to one of the political parties because the saloons were very much part of that political system that ran the city. And so, in that sense, you didn't have to be politically connected to run a saloon, but it helped because if you were known as a saloon keeper who had access to those jobs, to that welfare system, you were more likely to get customers into your saloon because your customers knew, okay, if I buy my drinks at this saloon and something happens to me someday, that saloon keeper will repay my loyalty by helping my family. So having that political connection was helpful, but it wasn't necessary.
That's it. So, you mentioned the part about being enlisted into the Union Army, like right off the boat. So, tell me more about the Irish immigrants' contribution to the war.
So the Irish immigrants play a very large role in the American Civil War. Now, keep in mind, in New York, the Irish are a huge part of the population, whereas in the country overall, the Irish are a tiny part of the population. So, in terms of the entire Union Army, the Irish are, a small percent, uh, maybe 10% of the army, if that. But in some units, the Irish are huge. And in fact, in many big cities where the Irish were a large population, um, the Irish started their own regiments, feeling that they would be discriminated against in a regular volunteer regiment, just like they were discriminated against in other parts of life. A lot of the famine immigrants started their own regiments. So you had in New York, the 69th Regiment was the famous Irish regiment. But there were several Irish regiments in New York because the city had so many Irish immigrants. So much that you had an Irish battalion made up of several Irish regiments. And eventually, Irish regiments from Boston and Philadelphia and other places joined that Irish brigade. And so they play kind of an outsized role in the fighting in the first half of the war, especially in the East. So at places like Bull Run, the 69th Regiment plays an important role in the fighting at Fredericksburg, at Gettysburg, some of the key battles at the beginning of the war. The Irish regiments suffer inordinate casualties because they are kind of put at the front lines, in part because of the prejudice. Two ways. In part, because of the prejudice that the Irish are known to be good fighters. It's thought that the Irish are always fighting, they're always brawling, they're always rioting, so they'd make good soldiers. And then it's possible too that there's prejudice the other way, saying, well, if the Irish die, they're kind of less valuable. Their lives are less valuable than a Protestant's lives anyway. You don't see that ever said out loud. You do all the time see it said out loud by the officers. We should throw the Irish in there because they're the best fighters and they never give up. So the Irish play a significant role in the Civil War.
One of the important events in New York City during the Civil War were the draft riots, 1863, I believe. Yeah, the Gangs of New York movie depicted this too in the final third.
Yep.
So, why did they happen, and to what extent were the Irish immigrants part of it?
So at the beginning of the Civil War, the war is fought entirely by volunteer soldiers. And people think that will be enough because nobody expects it to be a very long war. On both sides, everyone thinks, oh, one or two battles will prove to the other side that they can't possibly win and the war will be over. But it turns out to be a long and very bloody war. And by 1863, the North needs more soldiers and institutes a draft. The South had instituted a draft the year before. The draft was not very popular in the South, but the South was a place where expressing opposition to the war was much more frowned upon than in the North. And so while there's opposition to the draft, it's fairly behind the scenes and muted. And you see it more in just people refusing to show up for the draft, people refusing to serve, running away, rather than the violence that you're going to have in the North in New York. In the South, the part of the draft law that is resented is the part that says if you have 20 or more slaves, you're exempt from the draft. And the rationale was you need a white man at home to supervise the slaves so they don't go off and rape and pillage. In the North, the part of the law that's most hated is what was known as the $300 clause. That said, if you got drafted but didn't want to serve, if you gave the government $300, you were exempt. And that was resented by poor Northerners who said that's going to turn this into a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. And they said, that's not fair. And that resentment builds to a head in New York City when the draft is started in July of 1863. And so they have all over the city, every congressional district of the city had its draft, and you would have this. Everybody who was eligible for the draft was put on a list. Next to their name were consecutive numbers on the list. They had these big, the kind of things they use for the lottery today, these big wheels with numbered balls in them, and they'd spin the wheel, and they'd have a person with blindfold, or sometimes when they didn't trust that, they'd find a blind person to reach their hand into the wheel and choose out numbers. And then they'd look at the number next to that name, and that person was drafted. At that point, you weren't automatically in the Army. You then had to go before the draft board, and you could be exempted if you could prove you were not eligible, either because you were too sickly to fight, or for instance, if you weren't a citizen. So only citizens or people who had started the citizenship process. So if you had been in the country 4 years and you had applied to be a citizen, citizens and people who had applied to be citizens were eligible for the draft. So you could go before the board and say, hey, you drafted me, but I'm not a citizen. And if you hadn't applied to be a citizen, you couldn't be forced to fight. And the fact is, in those days, there was no central list of naturalizations like there is today. Today, the federal government does all the naturalizations. But back then, any court could naturalize you and make you a citizen. And they kept all their records separately in the various courts. So it was possible if you're an Irish immigrant, you could and got drafted, you could go and say, oh, I'm not a citizen. And the government couldn't prove you were. Unless they could find a witness who said, oh, no, I was there. I saw him get naturalized. So that was the process. But nonetheless, the Irish, who are the poorest New Yorkers, are most resentful of the draft, in part because they are least likely to have the $300 to get exempted, but also because they're resentful of the Emancipation Proclamation. And they're afraid that by making the slaves free, that the Irish, who even though they had kind of been at the bottom of the American socioeconomic ladder, could always say to themselves, well, we're not really the bottom. Blacks are the bottom. They're the worst off. They don't have the rights we have. They can't vote like we do. They're way more discriminated against than we are. But the Irish resented the Emancipation Proclamation because they said, well, wait a second, now we're not really in terms of rights any better than them. Now blacks have the same rights we have. And the Irish resented that, a lot of them. And they said, by giving them more rights, that makes our rights less valuable. They found it degrading. That was the term they would use, degrading, to be at the same level as the former slaves. And so when the draft starts, the Irish in one of the uptown wards, what's now Midtown Manhattan, riot destroy the wheel and the balls and all that apparatus. And the riot spreads throughout the city. Um, and there's tons of violence, and the rioters tend to focus their violence on Republicans and blacks. And so they burn the houses of well-known Republicans, and they attack black New Yorkers and lynch about a dozen of them. And so the violence is terrible, and it goes on for 3 or 4 days, and about 100 people are killed in the rioting. Uh, it's the most deadly example of civil unrest in all of American history that isn't related to a foreign invasion. And so that's the draft riot. Now, I don't know many more questions you have, but I need to wrap up because I've got another Zoom history thing at 11:30,
Okay. Well,
which is 10 minutes from now for me.
all right. So I'll just end with this since we're at the closing time anyways. What is the most notable legacy of Irish New York that we can see today?
Hmm. Wow. No one's ever asked me that question. That's a good one. Um, I think the most notable legacy of the famine Irish New York, I'm going to use them in particular for my answer, is that the famine Irish proved to New Yorkers, and maybe to Americans in general, that anyone could make it in America. There had been this belief before then that you had to have certain attributes to succeed in America, that you had to be well educated, that you had to be Protestant, right? Up until the 1850s, America was a very self-consciously Protestant nation. And so when the famine Irish come to America, dirt poor by American standards, uneducated by American standards, reviled for their religious beliefs, most Americans say, these people are going to be poor forever. They're going to be this dead weight on our society. But the famine Irish end up succeeding beyond wildly beyond the expectations of native-born Americans, starting their own businesses, saving money, buying homes, employing others. Not a dead weight at all, but actually a big boon to the economy. And that's the first time Americans changed the idea that, well, you have to have these certain attributes to succeed in America, and transition to what we end up calling the American dream, the idea that America is such a special place that anyone can succeed here if they are virtuous and work hard, and that the United States has these special attributes that make it so that anyone can succeed here. And so I think that's the biggest legacy of the Irish, that they prove those old superstitions, or what would be the right word? They prove the fallacy of the idea that if you're not Protestant, if you're not well educated, that you're going to be a failure in America. And so that is, I think, a really important and lasting legacy of the Irish in New York and beyond.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you very much, Professor Tyler Anbinder, for joining the show.
Thanks very much.